So welcome back to the channel. My name's Athena. So in this video we're going to be talking about the effects of religious trauma on our consciousness. So we're going to start looking at how empathy and love develop and what happens to us if something goes wrong and stops it from developing. So in the last video we looked at how religious trauma, it isn't just religious trauma, it's any trauma, especially childhood trauma, but because this channel is mostly about religious trauma, but it's exactly the same. All trauma is trauma, no matter what the source is. So So in the last video, we started to look at how religious trauma can cause our consciousness to hide in order to protect itself from further pain. In doing so, that impedes our connection with God. We may feel that we have not necessarily been mistreated, but the worst kind of mistreatment is not necessarily physical or sexual abuse. Sometimes the worst damage we experience as a child is neglect, which we've looked at, right? And especially emotional neglect, and that can be very subtle. Whenever we are taught to ignore our emotions and trust God, if we go to our fellow Christians and we say, we're experiencing this struggle or whatever, and they dismiss it and they go, well, you need to trust God, or you just need to pray more, or whatever it is, then our emotional needs are not being met. And we can be taught that from very young childhood, from a very young child in when we have religious upbringings. And the more religious the church or the family, the more this is going to happen, and it embeds in us. So we looked at neglect, what it is and how it can deeply damage our sense of self. Any form of abuse, especially spiritual abuse, where God and the scriptures are weaponized to manipulate and control, can cause our consciousness to hide from a vengeful God. Instead of having an open heart to his love, we shut down our heart to protect ourselves or our inner child. We may still think we're expressing it because 3 times a week we go to church and we worship, and we may think, oh yes, well, we're worshiping, so we're connecting to God, but in actual fact our heart is hiding from God. A false gospel and false doctrines lead us away from the truth about God. So instead of teaching us that God is love and that we can go to him no matter what we're feeling, no matter what the circumstances are, false doctrines shut that down, right? Well, you can't unless you're perfect. You've got to be perfect. We can come to God just as we are, but no, you have to be perfect. Otherwise, he's going to send you to hell. And that kind of gospel does not lead to God. So as I've said, a false gospel tends to create atheists, not disciples. It creates people who, in the end, don't end up believing in God because they don't experience him. They've shut down so much through the message of a false gospel. They're not connecting. There's no divine connection. And so if they have to keep believing by faith, then eventually they go, well, there is no evidence for God, because they're not experiencing evidence for God. So in the video we did on Adam and Eve, we looked at how humans were created with subconsciousness and then consciousness. Now, all humans develop like this. We're born with an active subconsciousness, and then our consciousness is awakened around the age of 3 to 6 years. Love and care by our primary caregivers encourages our consciousness to develop, or if you like, to come out and play. So if we are mistreated, or in the case of spiritual abuse, if we have our free will reduced by the presentation of the ever-watching, ever-vengeful God who's just waiting with lightning rods to throw down and hurt us and punish us for the slightest infraction, then our consciousness may hide, right? It hides from God, or it slumbers. Now, when I talk about the consciousness, some people say our spirit, our personal spirit. As I've said, I believe that's the same. It's the same thing. Our consciousness or our personal spirit is the same thing. And then until I'm convinced otherwise, that is what I'm running with. Now, as I've said, this can happen in any family where neglect or abuse is present. So when this happens, we will then operate mostly out of our subconsciousness. So if we're subconscious, if we are made up of subconsciousness and consciousness, and our consciousness is hiding or is slumbering, is falling asleep, then obviously we're going to operate out of our subconsciousness. Interestingly, it's in our subconsciousness that our wounded child resides. So even though the wounded child operates in the subconsciousness, it's the wounded child that tells the consciousness to protect itself from any perceived threats or harm. So the wounded child in our subconsciousness will tell our consciousness, hide, before they can hurt me again, hide to protect yourself. Now again, let me say, I need to keep on reiterating this, that this can happen to varying degrees. It's not necessary that we're fully awake, that our consciousness is fully awake, or that it's fully asleep, but it can happen on a spectrum like most things. So what we want to do now is look at what the subconsciousness controls, those functions within the human that it controls, and what the consciousness controls, because then we can understand what might be happening in our psyche that isn't necessarily working at its best possibilities. So let's begin. And I posit here that if the child is wounded enough, the inner child is wounded enough, it causes the consciousness to hide or slumber, as I've said. Again, in our video on Adam and Eve, we looked at three main things. The first thing was that Adam and Eve were created in God's image, which is light. They had subconsciousness. They were not self-aware. When they ate from the tree of knowledge, they became beings with consciousness. They became self-aware. Then God gave them physical bodies so that they could become sentient. Consciousness allowed them to interpret the qualia that they received by their five senses. So, through our seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, and feeling. This allows them to understand real from imaginary. That's really important because that helps going forward. You'll see how important that is because it helps us to understand what's true and what's not true. So are we, by how active our consciousness and our subconsciousness is, if they're working beautifully together, we're less likely to get caught up in deception. We're more able to discern that which is truth from that which is crap. Okay? And we also I'll just go back. This allows it allows us to understand real from imaginary. It also allows us to develop our sense of self and others. And we need this in order to develop empathy and love, which is essential in relationships. Now, if we just put that together briefly, you'll see that there is a link to those who are prone to deception and those who have an inability to have empathy and love for other people or compassion. And you'll see that those two go hand in hand. People who are under deception are very often people who have difficulty with empathy and compassion. And that's why you get these deceptive religious leaders, right? And false prophets that lie and don't care what effect it has on the lives of people, because all they're interested in is what they're getting out of it, which is fame and money, right? So all the sciences agree that humans have subconsciousness and consciousness, right? So that's not in disagreement anywhere, whether it's, physics or psychology or neuroscience or religion. Everybody believes that we humans have subconsciousness and consciousness. So we want to look at the role of these two things. So what is the role of subconsciousness in the human? So this is what it governs. The subconsciousness governs our habits and patterns. So if we get stuck in habits and patterns, it's because we're stuck in the subconscious. The conscious area is not being able to assist, right? It also governs our automatic body function. So, if I get an itch and I lift my hand to scratch it, that belongs to the subconsciousness. And this is why people who have significant neglect or abuse and where their consciousness is hiding appear to act robotic or quasi-autistic. And I've attached studies to this, I think, in the last video about quasi-autism. There's a certain roboticness to them. They're not as fluid. I noticed this, it's interesting. I noticed this in dancing because I used to teach dancing. You would have dancers who just had a natural flow. It was a natural creative gift, and it was because subconsciousness and consciousness were going, and they just had a creative flair and they could just flow with it. But then you had others who learned the steps, but that flow wasn't there. They were doing the steps and they were doing it right, but you could almost see their brain counting the numbers, 5, 6, 7, 8, 1, 2, 3, 4. You could see them doing it, and it was that roboticness. And it was because their consciousness wasn't connecting to the subconsciousness as well as other people. And so the creative or the flow, it's not necessarily creative, but just the natural flow of letting the body go with it. Okay, so it also governs the emotions. People who have a hiding consciousness may have trouble regulating their emotions, such as abusers, They know that, we talk about the cycle abuse. So abusers know that they abuse, right? But then they go back through this cycle where they can't control it. They have trouble regulating their emotions. So when the anger comes, they can't control. Subconsciousness also governs our personality. It governs our beliefs and values. It governs our cognitive biases. So people who have a religious spirit or who are they don't even have to be religious. They might be atheists, but they're stuck in this ideology that they're not going to give. That's usually subconscious cognitive biases, right? It also governs our long-term memory. Oh my goodness. Our subconsciousness records everything. The reason why I'm so amused by that is my mum. You know, well, I've written here, some people with narcissistic personality disorder remember all your infractions, everything from years ago that you ever did against them, they will happily bring up and throw in your face to cause shame and guilt, right? So that's because the long-term memory is held in the subconsciousness. The subconsciousness is not aware of both internal mental function and external happenings. So by itself, it struggles to interpret qualia. The subconsciousness is not logical. So when people grasp onto conspiracy theories, you know, it's really hard to try and show them the logic behind some of that, you know, the garbage of it, even though you can tell them they're like, nope. Okay, the subconsciousness works 24 hours a day, so it's what activates our dreams. I believe the unconsciousness can do that too, but I believe that the subconsciousness is the main culprit behind a lot of our dreams. I mean, God can give us dreams as well. The Holy Spirit can give us dreams, but if they're not a Spirit-inspired dream, it's usually the subconscious trying to tell us something. Okay, so the subconscious is creative. The subconscious has no filter. Again, think of the narcissistic personality disorder person and others. There are plenty of people who have no social filter, right? So the subconsciousness takes everything literally. It's unable to grasp allegory and may struggle to understand jokes. It needs clear orders and images, so it has to colour between the lines, doesn't always understand play or joking around. The subconsciousness resists change. So if someone is struggling for years in regards to some kind of habitual sin or weakness, then it could be that the consciousness is hiding in that area. Now, the subconsciousness cannot tell or struggles hard to tell the difference between real and imaginary, and that's why I was saying before that the game of peekaboo really helps babies' consciousness to develop and come out and play. The game of peekaboo teaches them, you know, what's real and what's not real. Okay, mum has disappeared, mum is there. But what the baby learns is mum hasn't disappeared, it just looks like mum has disappeared. So they learn the difference between what is truth, what is real, and what is imaginary. The subconsciousness can't tell the difference between right and wrong, or if you want, good and evil. The world is moving as a collective in this direction at the moment, right? Where the world, because the collective consciousness of man, of humanity is slowly going to sleep. We're getting worse at being able to love, right? We're becoming more cold-hearted, which is what the Bible said would happen at the end of this age. As we close out this particular age, it said that people would become more cold-hearted, and we are. We're moving, as we move more into that direction, then it's becoming harder for the world to tell what's right and wrong. You know, that which is right is being said is wrong, and that which is wrong is being said is right, and all that stuff. So misinformation has a lot, and deception by the church has a lot to blame for that. So the subconsciousness cannot tell the difference between self and others. So when the consciousness is hiding, think of the behaviour of a 2-year-old, because a 2-year-old hasn't yet developed or had its consciousness awakened yet. So a 2-year-old is working out of its subconsciousness, and that's normal. That's normal for a 2-year-old, right? But just we're meant to grow out of that, right? We're meant to mature. Our consciousness is meant to come out, and we're meant to mature on emotionally. But if you think of the 2-year-old, then that gives you a really clear idea of what a person is like when they're acting out of their subconsciousness, only they might be an adult, right? So think of the tantrums, cries until it gets what it needs. So whinges and whines until it gets what it needs is unreasonable. You can't reason with a person who's like a 2-year-old. They've got no ability to critically think, and they lack awareness of others. So you think of a 2-year-old that doesn't care where it throws a tantrum, it's not aware of its surroundings, doesn't care if it hurts others. So in other words, it hasn't developed self-awareness or empathy. So people like that are operating out of their subconscious mind where the wounded child resides. So they are acting like a wounded child all the time because they haven't got the consciousness to help them regulate. So people whose consciousness is completely hidden or asleep act like a 2-year-old or an adult version of a 2-year-old. But like I've said, it happens on a spectrum. So the very worst are like that. So, I mean, have you ever noticed that a lot of wounded people are sometimes childish in their behaviour or in their emotions? They don't seem to have an adult or mature way of dealing with things. They throw tantrums like a child and can be easily offended. As I've said, this is because they're operating out of their subconsciousness. They tend to be all about what is hurting them without having any sense of how they're hurting others, so not self-aware. So again, go back to the abuser. If you think of, say, spousal abuse, right, where the husband is only concerned, well, sorry, can be female, but it is mostly males, but women do it. But we'll just say him. For the example, so say he comes in and he's offended by something that she's done. She's not doing something that makes him happy. He has no awareness of the pain that he causes her by his verbal abuse or physical abuse or sexual abuse. He's got no awareness of the pain, no empathy or compassion for the pain that he's causing her, but he expects her to do everything that makes him happy and doesn't offend him in any way. And as I said, that can be reversed, can be female, male, male, female. So having studied my mother, who had narcissistic personality disorder and was very high on the spectrum, I posit that her consciousness had fallen completely to sleep. So consciousness is necessary to develop empathy, and she displayed a complete lack of empathy. She really had no ability to have compassion or to really love. Now, I just want to say here that I loved my mother very much. I'm just using her as an example, and I want to say that I honour her life, right? She did her best. Now, I have said that the consciousness can hide or slumber to varying degrees, and it does this to protect itself. So the variations will depend on the level of harm perceived by the mind of that child, right? As to how much the consciousness needs to protect itself and hide. So the consciousness will hide in comparison to how great the threat the child perceives. And I posit that if a person experiences too much harm and they don't experience love, especially in those first couple of years of life, that their consciousness can go into full hiding. It can be completely asleep. In actual fact, I don't think it's ever awakened. And I believe that's what causes full-blown narcissistic personality disorder. Now, I can't speak for all cases. I am not speaking for all cases. I can only share what I learnt about my mother. Now, my mother could not be empathic at all. She had no ability to identify my emotions. She had no ability of self and other. She only had self, right? She was extremely emotionally neglectful. She ignored my cries for help. She didn't know how to pacify me. When I was hurting, she always dismissed my pain. Her emotional neglect of me was probably my deepest wounding, but she always expressed her own emotional needs. Think of the 2-year-old child, right? She always let others know when they had hurt her. I posit my mother herself was damaged to the point that she was acting only out of her subconsciousness. As I said, she acted like a 2-year-old, including narcissistic rage when her needs weren't being met. Now, I think the narcissistic rage is the adult form of a 2-year-old tantrum. And sometimes they don't know, like a 2-year-old. Sorry, I've got an eyelash or something in my eye. I'm not crying or anything. I've got an eyelash. I put mascara on for the videos and I'm not used to it. So maybe my eyelashes are sticking. I don't know. Anyway, they say that narcissists are entirely self-centered, but I posit that they've never developed an awareness of self and others. You know, I don't think that they're selfish. I just think that they're not turned on. That's what I think. I believe that they suffered such neglect at an early age that their consciousness was never able to awaken. So no one played peekaboo with my mother. No one loved her so that her consciousness knew that it was safe to come out. Where it should have developed between the ages of 3 to 6 years, the neglect she received prior to that age caused her consciousness to stay fully asleep before it even had a chance to be brought to life. An interesting observation about my mother was she could never relay a joke. She just didn't get the nuances. Somebody would tell a joke and she tried to relay it on, and and it used to fascinate me until I understood that she just couldn't identify the emotions. You know, she just did not get the nuances of it. My mother would use sarcasm. She'd make an unkind comment to myself or to someone else and think that it was funny. She didn't have any comprehension of the pain the other person was experiencing because of her words. If the other person got offended with what she said, she would just tell them to get over themselves. She had a complete unawareness of others. Her empathy and love never bloomed in her. And as I was reading that, I was remembering this situation once. My mum used to always call me bitch. You little bitch. You know, I'm sure other people who've had narcissistic parents have experienced that. And I really wasn't a bad child. Maybe I developed some bad habits as I got older, but I wasn't a bad child. But and I was standing with her one day when she relayed this story on to this lady she was having a conversation with. I don't know that she knew this lady very well, but she was having a conversation. And I remember her telling this other lady this story. And she said, my daughter came to me one day and said, is bitch my middle name? And she went, oh, I thought that was so funny. And the other woman was shocked. You saw the shock come over her face that my mother thought this was a funny story to tell on to other people and didn't get the nuances, didn't understand that it was exposing her as a really bad mother. But the look on this other lady's face, I'll never forget it. I mean, that's a horrible story to tell, but that's what she was like. And that's fine because, you know, it was my mother. As I learn, I might get to it. I'll get to it a bit further on. So now I want to just compare the functions of people who are operating out of their subconsciousness to people with narcissistic personality disorder. And not that I think any of you have that, but you will find that a lot of religious leaders who cause abuse do have it. And so because we're talking about religious trauma and trying to understand what actually happened to us, this is why I want to talk about this, because having a mother who had that and then seeing the way some really bad, abusive religious leaders are, and the fact that God is dealing with them at the moment, He is exposing them, not only the leaders, but the abusive and corrupt behaviour of the Christian church. He's exposing it at the moment. Then I think it helps us to understand these things. So people like this cannot tell the difference between right and wrong, right? They're abusive and hypocritical. So they can stand up and preach a gospel that they've heard. They relay that gospel because they've been taught it and they relay it verbatim, but they're living the most immoral and abusive lifestyles. They have no compassion, no sense of justice or empathy for victims. That's a very NPD way of living your life. Now, my mother was a Christian. She was American, as I've mentioned before, and she was of the ilk that she was a conservative, Republican, Christian, but she lived a hypocritical life. We went to church every week, but during the week, there was no praying to God. There was no Bible study. There was no seeking God if there was an issue in our family. And she sinned when it met her needs, I won't tell you what she did. You can guess. I'll leave it with you. So they can't tell the difference between self and others, as I've said. They lack empathy and compassion. And so therefore injustice follows them. Right, they hurt people and they have no ability to to bring restitution to their victims. They can't tell the difference between real and imaginary, so they can't tell the difference between what is true and what isn't, and that's why gaslighting is a big thing they do. Gaslighting isn't a trick that they use to get you off the scent. Gaslighting is they honestly think they're telling the truth. They honestly think they're telling the truth. And it's because they can't tell the difference between what's true and what's not. And they need their needs met while neglecting others and as I've said, dismissing the needs of the victims. So as soon as they're caught out, they'll be going, oh, but look at what was done to me. That person did this to me, and how can you speak about me behind my back, and, stop exposing me and all that kind of stuff. They only see their needs. So what we're going to do now is look at the role of our consciousness and what it does within, why we need it, why humans need consciousness. Now, consciousness is a beautiful gift from God. Consciousness is the seat of all our plannings and goals and dreams and our purpose. And those are amazing things. Sorry, I feel it. Those are amazing things for us to set our mind on. Oh, sorry. Consciousness is also, one of its functions is willpower. It also gives us the power to make free will choices, and that's the difference. When our consciousness goes to sleep and we're subconscious, our responses are robotic rather than free will choices. So we make necessary choices, not necessarily free will choices that just come out of us, because we're natural, and this is a natural response. It's the seat of our critical thinking. It's the seat of our short-term memory, our ability for analysis, our behaviours. This is where our behaviours is where we can. The others is more of our habits and behaviours in our subconscious. This is our behaviours. This is, if our consciousness is really active, is where we can overcome our sins and our weaknesses, right? Our consciousness also enjoys play and joking. Our consciousness is what understands the nuances of play. So if the consciousness is deeply asleep, laughter can be restrained. It's not so natural. Our consciousness usually only works while awake. And our consciousness is aware of both internal mental functions and external happenings. So it can interpret qualia. So what our consciousness is conscious of, it can help our subconsciousness work together in life so that we get a more full experience of life. So in other words, we become more mature. It helps us to regulate our emotions. It helps us to understand the world around us and how then to act within the world or in response to the world. So the next 4 functions of consciousness I want to expound a bit on. Okay, so consciousness gives us our judgment decisions. Now that involves perceiving objects or events and coming to a conclusion about whether they are good or bad. Now remember, if we're operating out of our subconsciousness only, we have difficulty doing that. So consciousness is essential for understanding good and bad. Legalistic Christians are asleep in this area. They interpret everything literally. They have difficulty with abstract interpretations. They struggle with interpreting the Bible. They see everything as literal, and they may not be able to see the analogy or the nuances of the parable. So Jesus often had to interpret his parables for the disciples. They often only saw the literal meaning. So, they thought that Jesus was going to come and fight off the Romans, and this was the kingdom he was going to bring in. And he had to explain, no, the kingdom is within you, and all that kind of stuff. So I've noticed that atheists often interpret the scriptures only through a literal lens. Now, this may be deliberate in order to support their ideology, but they often belittle Christians for offering the nuances of the scriptures, claiming that this is cheating. So atheists will use, the literal meaning of Bible scriptures in order to prove that God is evil or that he doesn't exist or whatever. But if you say, oh no, you don't understand the nuance of that scripture or the analogy that is meant to be presented, they'll go, well, you're cheating. You're just changing it to make it, true. So sometimes that's deliberate, and other times it's because they're acting out of their subconscious only, right? In other words, they're taking the classical view, they're not taking the quantum view. So the consciousness is, one of the functions is communication and language. Now, these two things are essential for relationships. So if you're asleep in that area, you're going to struggle with relationships. So these two things are essential for connection to others, especially intimacy. If we struggle with being able to be intimate, and I'm not just talking about sexual intimacy, although that can be part of it, I'm talking about having an intimate emotional connection to your significant other. So we may be sleeping in that area if we're struggling. So these two things are absolutely essential for connecting to the divine. So for connecting to God. When we play with others, our consciousness, or our spirit, if you like, reaches out to the other person's spirit, or our consciousnesses. That's what it talks about when the two will become one. I don't know what other people will think they mean when it says the two will become one. It means our consciousness reaches out to play with the consciousness of the other person. So when it says that we're to have the same will of God, it doesn't mean we're not allowed to make any choices of our own. We're only allowed to do what God says we must obey. That's not what it's talking about. When it says to have the same will, it means to have the same consciousness. It means that our consciousness reaches out to God's consciousness, and our consciousness become one. Our will becomes one. And then we can have the same purpose, right? And it's always based in love, always based in love. And that's what intimacy is, and that's how intimacy works. And I'll talk more about that at some other times. Right, another thing that, another function of our consciousness is our actions. So this is an interesting area that we'll get into more in depth in another video, but basically our actions are where hypocrisy is evident. So we may believe in something, we may verbally declare allegiance to a belief, but if the consciousness is sleeping, we may not actually live out our belief. So for example, our subconsciousness can have a belief system that says, like, our core belief, and it might go, well, we believe in equality for all, right? We may go to rallies, we may wave the flag in support of equality for all, but then we may also support changing laws that prevent speech that is opposing our position. So in other words, equality for all is really only power when it supports what I want, but not for those who oppose what I want. And that's hypocrisy. And religious leaders often do this. So they will do something like impose purity laws on their congregants, and especially on the youth, right? Whilst living in deep immorality themselves. And we've seen quite a number of people fall, religious leaders fall recently because of that very thing. And they weren't all your Pentecostal charismatic types. There was a lot of evangelicals that fell for that. I won't name them. Okay, so the consciousness can change behaviours, where the subconsciousness is usually stuck in its behaviour and is very robotic. The consciousness can change behaviours, and we'll get to that when we talk about walking after the flesh or walking after the spirit, and how God gives us the Holy Spirit in order to help us change our behaviours, right? But the Holy Spirit has to connect with our consciousness, not our subconsciousness. Okay, so I've gone on to say here, we will show how we can overcome bad behaviours so that we are completely free of their influence over us. And this is almost impossible to do when we operate out of our subconsciousness alone, which I just said. So we can sometimes sustain change by the mind. So, and we can do that by willpower alone. For an example, you know, we might diet well for a while, right? So our mind can overcome our habits for a certain period, but then we may fall back into old habits. So, and that's because we're trying to use the mind, subconsciousness, to control our habits or to help overcome our habits, where we need our consciousness to be involved in that. Okay, so both subconsciousness and consciousness need to be operating at reasonable levels in order to achieve emotional maturity and freedom. And this is what I believe the Bible means by holiness, right? I don't believe in it in it meaning that we're absolutely, you know, morally perfect. But the more emotional maturity we come to, the less likely we are to hurt other people. Okay, so that's the end of subconsciousness and consciousness in this video, at least. We do also have unconsciousness. Now, I'm not going to be speaking much on that. We might get to that at some other time, but just briefly, the unconscious mind holds that which we want to conceal, especially from ourselves. So this includes trauma, really bad trauma, sometimes fear, shame and guilt. And the Bible calls this defilement. And you'll rarely ever hear church leaders teach on this. I did write a bit about it in my book on holiness. Yeah, but as I said, we'll get to that at some other time. When we're knocked out in a trauma, a physical trauma event, or we're in a coma, or if we're under anesthesia, we're usually considered unconscious, right? So as I said, extreme trauma can be relegated to the unconscious mind, such as, you know, and then it's amnesia. Okay, so just to summarize, if we believe, sorry, I don't know what I'm saying there. I believe that if there is enough wounding to the subconsciousness, it causes the consciousness to hide, or if you like, slumber, especially when this wounding is experienced in our early developing years. So what I want to do starting in the next video is start to talk about if any of this is registered for you. Maybe it helps you understand for other people, but if any of this is registered for you and you think that maybe, you know, there may be areas that your consciousness has fallen asleep or whatever, then in the next video, what I'm going to start doing is talking about some things that we can do to bring our consciousness back awake again, or out of hiding, if you like. So we'll leave it there. I'm looking forward to doing the next one. Yeah, I'm looking forward to doing the next video. I've kind of got the I don't know, the literal stuff out of the way now, and I can start talking about how we can heal from the damage that's been done. Okay, so bless you on your journey.